Hello and welcome to my top 100 Spectrum games, numbers 20 to 11. My number 20 game is Trashman. Trashman was released in 1984 by New Generation Software and was written by Malcolm Evans. When it came to the Spectrum, and the ZX81 for that matter, Malcolm Evans was Mr. 3D. However, his 3D games weren't 3D in the way that Nightlaw or Alien 8 or Batman or Head Over Heels were. There was not in 3D, which is a first-person perspective 3D, or things like Escape, which is a maze game where there's a forced perspective. And basically, in Escape, you can kind of disappear behind the hedges that you're running round. And there's a bit of shading to show where the hedges are and where the paths are, but other than that, there's no real 3D to it. It doesn't have the depth that something like Nightlaw has. And Malcolm used that forced perspective, that same perspective where you're looking from a certain angle, which means you can disappear behind things, but there isn't really a lot of 3D in there in Trashman. Now, according to the world of Spectrum, Malcolm also wrote a game called 3D Defender in 2003. Which was a ZX81 game that was ported to the Spectrum. Now, I've not played this, but I think I'm going to go and have a look and try it out. In Trashman, you play the Trashman, and your objective is to collect a certain number of bins from a certain road. Yeah, there's no alien blasting or problem solving or anything like that. In this game, all you've got to do is collect bins. Now, for anyone who hasn't played this game, you're probably thinking, why on earth have you made your number 20 game one where you collect bins? You put a rubbish 3D game, that's the 3D being rubbish, not the actual game itself, much higher than something like Head Over Heels. How on earth could you do that? Well, despite the rubbish premise, and that was a pun, but the earlier rubbish wasn't a pun, this game is really, really good. And the thing that makes this game so good is all of the obstacles in this poor Trashman's way. You have a really tight time limit. You're not allowed to stand on any grass at all, be it the verges at the side of some of the later roads or the grass in the gardens of the houses that you collect the bins from. In fact, if you do stand on the grass in some of those houses, they'll let a dog out of their house and he'll come and bite your leg. And when you have a bitten leg, you limp, making your job even harder. You can also start to limp if you get hit by a bike that's riding on the pavement in some of the later screens as well. However, you don't limp if you get hit by a car or, of all indignity, your refuse truck. If the car or the refuse truck hit you, then you die. And that's it, game over. You only have one life in this game. It's very true to real life. With the tight time limit and all of these obstacles, how on earth do you ever manage to complete a screen? Well, there is a little bit of salvation. If you can collect, empty and redeposit a person's bin without standing on their grass, then they will open their door and say something to you and give you a tip. And that tip means increased time. And one of the best things about this game is all of the funny things that people say when they open their doors. While I'm talking about tips, another obstacle from later in the game is if somebody at a pub offers you a tip, then don't take it. It's really, really tempting because it tends to be a really large amount of time that they'll add to your timer. But you don't get that time, and when you come out of the pub, you're staggering all over the place, making the game even harder again. First time I got to the pub, I thought, great, I'll go in there and get a really huge tip. Then I came staggering out and walked straight into a car. Now, I've never managed to complete this game without save states. I have managed to complete it eventually using save states, and I think the reason is that, especially on some of the later levels, I just always end up getting run over by a car. The difficulty does really, really ramp up, and that time limit can be really, really tight, so you have to rush. And rushing over the road makes it really hard, and you'll get hit by a car. I've wanted to do a walkthrough of this game for ages, but it would break my number one rule, which is I don't use save states when I do my walkthroughs. This might just be the game that makes me break that, and the reason is that my mum used to love watching me play this game. The reason she loved it is she loved all the little jokey anecdotes that people would tell when they came out of their houses and offered you a tip. In particular, I think she liked the one where someone says, "Do you think I'm a megalomaniac?" And then when you come out the house, he's shouting after you, "Give me a ZX81 and I'll rule the world." I'd love to complete this game one day and do a commentary for it and do my shout out to my mum just because of that. But it just might mean I have to use save states. If I run out of games I can complete without save states, maybe I'll just start using save states. I do remember reading a few years ago in Retro Gamer magazine that Malcolm Evans' daughter was so proud of her father being such a good ZX Spectrum programmer that she'd set up a web page for him. Doing a quick Google now, I can't actually find that. I did look for it a few years ago, or a year or so ago, when I realised I'd get to Trashman in this list, but I can't find it. I couldn't find it then, I can't find it now. Maybe it doesn't exist anymore. If anyone knows and has the address, please let me know in the comments. So that's my number 20 game, Trashman. My number 19 game is Saberwolf. Saberwolf was released in 1984 by Ultimate Play the Game, yet another Ultimate game in my list. It was their next release after Attic Attack, and in ways it took a step back from Attic Attack. It was a maze game like Attic Attack, and it was a huge maze, probably bigger than Attic Attack. I've never compared the two, so I don't know which is bigger. But unlike Attic Attack, where you would pick up objects that had a specific thing to do, that kind of bit of arcade adventure that there was to Attic Attack, there isn't really any in Saberwolf. You can pick up objects, but they just serve to give you more points or do something special. And there are only two objects that really do anything special. There are the bits of the amulet of Saberwolf, which will get you out of the jungle, get rid of the Guardian right at the end. And there are what's supposed to be dolls, like voodoo dolls I think they're supposed to be, that give you extra lives. Now I don't know about anybody else, but I've never thought those things that give you extra lives look like dolls in Saberwolf. They look like little red cacti, let's face it. There's no one else ever thought that they look like little red cacti. When I was young and I got this game, I couldn't for the life of me work out why a little red cactus would give you an extra life. Thinking about it now, perhaps you use the spikes from the cactus to fend off the animals that have got past your saber. Now there are all kinds of baddies in this game. Most of them just materialise after a few seconds in any particular area that you're in. And those kind of standard baddies you can fend off with your saber. And actually, it's that saber that makes this game quite unique. That play mechanic of the saber, I don't think there's any game exactly like it. So when you press the fire button, Saberman whips out his saber and kind of wields it in a very ungainly way. I never thought he looked that good with that saber, to be honest with you. And any of the baddies that are in the room that are just the normal standard baddies, he can kill with that and they disappear. They will respawn after a bit of time though. One problem with that, and something I've always found quite frustrating in this game, is that he can only wield his saber to the left or the right, not up or down, so any enemies that are above or below you can prove really problematic. Then there are some enemies that just can't be killed and will kill you if you come into contact with them. The first being the Saberwolf himself, who roams around the bottom of the maze. And to be honest with you, he doesn't really play that big a part in the game, other than being the face of the amulet as well as being that undefeatable baddie at the bottom of the maze. You can get him to stop in his tracks by whipping out your saber and pointing it at him, and he'll kind of hunch down and then leap at you and kill you. The best way to get around him is just to find a little gap in the maze and nip up there and let him wander past underneath you. If you stay too long in any one clearing, then some fire will appear and the fire can't be killed. Apparently, if you wait a long time in a clearing, the fire will extinguish and you get a really big bonus for that. There is a bit of gamesmanship in this game, apparently. You can go into a clearing where you just appear right on the very edge and kind of the rest of the clearing's blocked off, or the rest of that bit of the map's blocked off. And if you stay in one of them, then the fire will appear not in the piece you're in, and you can just stay there until the fire disappears and you get a really big bonus. Then there's the final guardian, the person who's guarding the exit to the jungle. He can't be killed, but if you have all 4 pieces of the amulet of Saberwolf, he'll move out of your way when you go into his clearing. The maze in this game is absolutely huge and is made up of areas that kind of all look very similar, so it's very easy to get lost in this game. If you want to complete this game, then a map is absolutely essential. The pieces of the amulet that you can collect always appear in clearings, so there are kind of mazy bits to the game with different branches that you can kind of go around, and then there are areas where it's just a clearing. Sometimes with something in it, you can get clearings with little lakes in them, and clearings with little huts in them, and clearings that have nothing in them at all. And the amulets themselves always appear in the clearings with nothing in them at all. There are also natives that wander around the jungle, and if they're in line with a piece of the amulet, they make kind of a funny noise. While they can't be killed, they can be made to get out of your way with a trusty whack of your sabre. Similarly, there are some kind of really big animals, hippos and rhinos and things like that, that also can't be killed but will change direction and get out of your way with a whack of your sabre. They appear kind of semi-randomly and sometimes can be placed somewhere really inconvenient that is really difficult to get past, particularly if you have to approach them from the top or the bottom. If that happens, you're going to go and have to find one of the orchids. So there are orchids that bloom in the game that can help you by making you invulnerable and giving you a certain power. The red orchids make you move a bit slowly. The blue orchids make you move quicker. The magenta orchids reverse your controls, which while at first can be a bit frustrating, at least you're invulnerable while you've got reverse controls. You just got to watch what happens when the orchid runs out. The yellow orchids induce kind of a temporary state of death. You don't lose a life, but everything kind of resets in the game. Everything goes off the screen that you're in. And the white orchids will cure any orchid effects that you've already got. The blue orchids are obviously the ones to go for. Now this game looks absolutely amazing. If there was anything that the Stamper brothers were good at, it was making a game look good. The use of colour is brilliant. At first glance you might think, is this a Spectrum game? How could they get so much colour into the screens without any colour clash? The graphics do flicker a little bit. I often found that Ultimate Graphics did flicker. Jetpack flickers a little bit, and in the same way I think Saberman just flickers every now and then when he's being animated, but nothing that really puts you off or you can overly notice. Like Attic Attack, this is a flick screen maze game, so there's no scrolling, so there's no flicker or any scrolling or anything like that, the screens just flick. And in the same way that Night Law led to a load of isometric 3D games by other programmers, Saberwolf kind of led to a load of very big maze games by other programmers. And the maze is absolutely huge. You have to go a huge way around it just to get from where you start to the exit. And funnily enough, the exit is tantalisingly close to where you start. Going back to the game now, it's quite interesting because it does still provide a challenge. It isn't easy. While you can quickly get back into it, it does take a lot of time to master. It's got a strange long levity about it. It's one that you can go away having mastered and then come back and need to master again. Unlike, say, Attic Attack, which I can complete every single time I play, even having years break between games. I've recorded 2 walkthroughs for this game for my channel already, so one uses what I call the brute force method of completing it, which takes the most skill. That way what you do is you just get very good at the game and basically visit every single clearing in the game looking for the pieces of the amulet. The next is a more tactical way of doing it. You can use the orchids tactically. You can kind of hang around where the orchids will bloom until you get the one you want to take out any risk of moving to the next part of the maze. And you can use the natives tactically to find out where the pieces of the amulet are and greatly cut down how much of the maze you need to visit. Strangely enough, that kind of second way is a lot more satisfying. There was a bit of controversy about this game when it came out because it was the first Ultimate game to be priced at that higher price point of about a tenner. I didn't actually get this game when it first came out. I'd read about it and I'd seen it. I'd been put off a bit because I'd really liked Attic Attack and loved Attic Attack, and it just didn't sound as good. Everyone said it was an Attic Attack clone, but wasn't that arcade adventure piece to it. So it wasn't until really late in the Spectrum's life where I think I got this on a budget or a compilation that I started playing it. But I do like the game, and I think the real time that I learned to complete it was when I got the Ultimate Collection and used to play it as part of that. If you've never played it before, it's distribution denied, so you can't just download it from the World of Spectrum website, but you can get it on Rare Replay. And as I've said before in this list, Rare Replay is just worth picking up anyway. That's my number 19 game, Saberwolf. My number 18 game is The Wild Bunch. The Wild Bunch was released in 1984 by Firebird Software and was written by Kevin Smith. It was part of Firebird's Silver range, which means that it only cost £2.50 when it first came out, and that was an absolute bargain for this game. Now, you know when you go to the taskbar at the bottom of Windows and you see Lock the Taskbar, and for some people, Rock the Casbar by The Clash kind of plays through their head. That's not only me, is it? I'm sure other people have that as well, and I'm sure I've actually seen it on TV or something where someone said that. Well, for me, every time I say The Wild Bunch, The Wild Boys by Duran Duran starts playing through my head. Yeah, and there it goes again. Apparently the Wild Boys were calling on their way back from the fire. Maybe the Wild Bunch were doing the same thing. This game has a Wild West setting, and in typical Wild West fashion, you are a man wrongly accused of murder and have to clear your name. At the start of your game, you're given some backstory, so you see a man dying on the street, a gun by his side, and he tells you that he was murdered by one member of the Wild Bunch. He doesn't tell you their name, but he does tell you their distinguishing feature, and this changes with every game. At the start of the game, you also get to choose a difficulty level. I've never actually worked out what the difference is between the difficulty levels, but one thing I'd say is I always choose the easiest because this game's hard enough on the easiest setting without making it more difficult. You get to start at one of 5 towns, and the towns in this game are Dry Gulch, Dodge City, Nugget City, Bulletville, and Dead Man's Creek. And they're kind of in 2 different areas, so the first 3 of those are all together and there's plains between them, and then the last 2 are just together and plains between them. But between the kind of 2 groups there are mountains and deserts that are really difficult to cross. God help you if your horse goes lame while you're crossing the desert and you don't have enough water. This is kind of another one of those strategy adventures that people who are regular listeners to my channel will know I'm a bit of a fan of. However, this has loads of extra bits to it. The World of Spectrum website describes these extra bits as in-game mini-games, and there are quite a few of those. The first thing I do when I start playing this game is head straight to one of those in-game mini-games, which is the poker game. There's nothing more essential in this game than a horse. It really helps the game. And the first thing I do is go to the saloon, start playing poker with the town gambler, and see if I can gamble my money up to enough to buy a horse. If I can't, I just generally reset the game and start again. Now I think if this game had been released just as that poker game, it would probably have been worth the £2.50 I paid for it. It's a bit predictable, and once you get your tactics right, you can pretty much beat the town gambler every single time. I think when you get to over $150, he throws his cards in and gives up. But you can just go and spend some of that money, so the first thing I spend it on is a horse, and then go back and play him again. The next thing I get is a saddle, and then all the essentials, some food, a new gun and some more bullets. I always find a Winchester rifle really useful for blasting things away. Although when you have a horse, running away from baddies is probably the best thing you can do. The next thing to do is go to the sheriff's office and have a look at the latest wanted pictures of the Wild Bunch. There are 5 members of the Wild Bunch: George Parkin, Harvey Logan, Ben Kilpatrick, Elza Lay, and Harry Longborough. And each one of those has some distinguishing feature, and they change a game between games. Sometimes one will have a limp in their leg, sometimes one will have an earring or a scar or a moustache. One thing you need to remember is when you look at the wanted posters, the picture's inverted, so if their earring is in their right ear or on the ear to the right of the picture, it will be their left ear where they have an earring. When I was young in particular, that tripped me up a few times. Write down the name of the Wild Bunch member and that distinguishing feature, and then hightail it over to the saloon again and have a look around and see if you can spot that person. Most of the time you can't. If you do spot him, you have 2 choices. You can take him prisoner and try and march him to the sheriff's office, but he might throw something at you and get away. Or you can fight him in a gunfight. And that's another one of the mini games in this game. The gunfight's quite good, although really hard to win. You're not allowed to draw before your opponent draws. But he draws pretty quickly, even on the lowest level. There's some music that plays, I think, a random number of times, although on the lowest level I think it always plays 3 times before your opponent draws. When you see his hand move, you press the key and shoot him. Make sure you have some bullets before you do this. I've been killed in this game by not having any bullets in my gun more than once. Then you take the body to the sheriff's office and say, "This was El Delay," and if you're lucky he'll agree. If you're unlucky he'll say something like, "No it's not, that's the local undertaker. You're going to prison for a long time." And even worse, he was going to bury the undertaker. What I've actually found to complete this game is, really what you have to do is shoot all the other members of the Wild Bunch whose names you know and you get, because you get all of the ones that aren't the one that was the real murderer before you get the one that was the real murderer, if that makes sense. So you've got to really get rid of all the other ones first, and there's only the murderer left who you can then find. You can't shoot him though. If you shoot him, he won't be able to confess to the murder, so you have to take the murderer prisoner. The last thing you can do in the town is go to the telegraph office and have a look and see what the latest telegrams are saying. You have to bribe the telegram office clerk to be able to see those though. In general, they'll tell you 2 things. There is a Pinkerton detective agent who is on your trail, and it tells you which town he was last seen in. And sometimes the Wild Bunch will have committed more crimes, so the prices that you'll get for capturing them or killing them will go up. Then you can travel to a new town and kind of rinse and repeat really. Go into the saloon and see if there's anyone there. After going to the sheriff's office, it's always worth going around quite a few towns to start with to see if you can identify any members of the Wild Bunch. At some point you're going to have to cross that desert or those mountains to get to the other group of towns to have a look at the wanted posters there and to keep hunting out the members of the Wild Bunch. Now this game really is addictive. You have kind of an amount of energy and you can fight various critters on your way between towns, and you use a certain amount of energy when you do that, or you can run, which takes 10 energy. Getting yourself a horse up front, as I said, and running away is by far the best policy. I don't care if he's a mad, mean, vicious Red Indian. I really don't want to kill him, I just want to run away from him. I have completed this game. I've completed it on quite a few occasions, but it's really difficult. You need to kind of get a lucky game. If it falls right and you find some of the members early on and get to eliminate them, then you tend to do well in the game. The annoying thing is that the detective who's after you quite often just seems to turn up randomly. I'm not quite sure what the algorithm is for determining when the detective turns up. And to be honest, I'm not sure how much help looking at the telegrams to say where he was last seen helps you either. They always seem to be in the same place. And while I avoid that place, sometimes he still turns up in somewhere that's not that place when I move on to the next town. If you've never played this game, I can highly recommend it. You don't have to start by playing poker, and another good tactic for getting money is spend all your money in the first town, move to another one, and quite often when you're really low on money, you'll find a gold nugget. And some of those gold nuggets can be worth quite a lot of money. It was a little slow when released on the Spectrum. I play this with the speed ramped up, either ×2 or ×4 when I play it on an emulator these days, so it does speed the game up a little bit when you do that. But it's very addictive and tremendous fun. If you like games like Football Manager, Rockstar Ate My Hamster, or any of those, give this a try. It really is good. Even if you don't give it a try. So that's my number 18 game, The Wild Bunch. My number 17 game is Pyjama Armor. Pyjama Armor was released in 1984 by Microgen and was written by Chris Hinsley. This was the follow-up to the game Automania, which was the first game that starred Wally Week. It was really the first Wally Week arcade adventure. Automania was more of a collect 'em up, whereas Pyjama Armor is more of an arcade adventure. And for me, I think this is the definitive arcade adventure on the Spectrum. In fact, thinking back, after Pyjama Armor, I don't think there was another arcade adventure on the Spectrum that really grabbed me. I like the Dizzy games, but I was never a really big fan of them. I like the follow-ups to Pyjama Armor, Everyone's a Wally, that's also in this list. But I never played Herbert's Dummy Run or 3 Weeks in Paradise, and I did play other arcade adventures. Attic Attack was a bit of an arcade adventure, but not to the level that Pyjama Armor is. Now, the thing that immediately hits you about this game is its attitude to colour clash. Some games use really clever techniques to get around colour clash. Games like Rex, where it has a kind of masking technique where your sprite disappears behind the foreground so that the colours of the foreground and your main sprite don't clash. Other games just use a simple technique like, say, monochrome. Towards the end of the Spectrum's life, there were loads of monochrome games. It does make shoot 'em truly difficult because it makes the bullets hard to see when they're monochrome. Slap Fight springs to mind. In Pyjama Armor, Microgen just took the attitude of ignoring it. Yeah, it's a Spectrum, there's going to be colour clash, get over it. But what this does mean is, in ignoring colour clash or not trying to do anything to get around it, you get these really big, bold colours and vibrant sprites and really, really good looking screens. Wally is a lovely big chunky sprite and he moves around really, really smoothly as well, so in not worrying about colour clash, not trying to do anything in the code to get over it, it means that all the code and processing can go into moving the sprites around. So they're big, bold, have lovely colours and animate really, really well. Well, while I'm talking about how good looking this game was, I think this has one of the best loading screens of any game on the Spectrum. I really, really love the loading screen to Pyjama Armor. Not only that, but when the game first starts up, you get a tune play. And I think there were two different ones. There's Popcorn and there's another one. And those two tunes are really, really good as well. I've said before that the Ultimate games tend to have a bit of polish to them, but this game felt like it also had that little bit of polish, a really good loading screen, a good tune at the end of the loading screen. In the game you play Wally Weak, and you're having a nightmare, literally. You're fast asleep and you need to walk around the nightmare and do things that will mean that Wally wakes up on time for work. To do this, you have to get the key to the alarm clock. However, this being a dream, there are all kinds of weird and wonderful things you have to do to be able to get that alarm clock key, including jetting off to the moon. Control of Wally's pretty simple. You can move left and right and jump. You have an inventory of 2 objects, and when you move over another object, you will pick it up. So there's no pickup key in this game, you just walk over an object and you collect it. It goes into the top of the inventory, and if there's something in the bottom of the inventory, then it replaces the object you've picked up. And as your inventory already starts full, there's always something at the bottom of the inventory, so you always pick one object up and leave one behind. And that's it really. There's not a huge amount to the gameplay other than that. You have a certain amount of snooze energy, which is your energy bar in the game. This diminishes slowly over time or quickly when you come into contact with certain baddies, and really, really quickly with some of the baddies. This can be replenished by finding various things as you walk around. I think there's a milkshake and an apple and a cup of tea. Those things always appear in certain places, so there's only a finite number of places where the food that replenishes your energy will appear. And you soon learn where they are. That can be quite useful, learning where they are. There's a mini game of Space Invaders in this game where if you go into a certain room, the video game room, you can play Space Invaders. I think if you get through a certain number of screens, you get an extra life, but I've never managed to get through enough screens to get that extra life without dying more times than I would have gained with the life, i.e. 2 or 3. Wally's dream self is half the size of his real self, so that means that everything looks twice as big as it should be. You can particularly tell this when you go into Wally's bedroom, so the sleeping Wally that you can see is about twice as big as your little sprite. This game was a crash smash, and going back and reading the crash review of it now, it's quite interesting. The reviewers compared it favourably to Manic Miner and Jet Set Willy. I was slightly surprised at that, because I thought, well, hold on, this is nothing really like Manic Miner or Jet Set Willy. The control mechanism's the same, and you do have to jump a little bit, but it's not a platform game. And then I guess you realise that in 1984, Manic Miner and Jet Set Willy were the standards by which a lot of things were judged. For me, one of the reasons why I really like this game as an arcade adventure is it feels that it's just the right size. I sometimes feel that games later in the Spectrum's life try to be too big and try to be too big an adventure. There's just enough to do in Pyjama Armor. The map of Pyjama Armor is just big enough. You need to learn it, and it can be a little confusing. One door can lead to somewhere that just isn't anywhere near where another door in the same room leads to. But then again, this is a dream that you're in, so logic doesn't really apply, so that doesn't matter. And the puzzles feel like they're just big enough as well. There's kind of just the right amount of puzzles in Pajama Armor. This was the first game for which I recorded a commentary, and I think that commentary took around 20 minutes. It takes around 20 minutes to complete the game, which again feels about just the right amount of time. If it was much longer than that, it would feel like too long. I think I'd also say that I don't think the puzzles are too obscure in this game. Some of them are a bit difficult to get your head around, but not too bad. And the room where you can slide down the banister is really, really good, which is part of one of the puzzles. As I say in my commentary for this game, I actually learned how to complete this game by reading the Crash playing tips section. And as someone pointed out in the comments to that, there was kind of a little ha-ha, I'm going to tell if you're using my playing tips to complete this game, in that there are things in there that you don't actually have to do to complete the game. They say, get this object before you go into this room, but you don't really need to do that. Quite a cunning tactic, I thought. Going back to the game now, it's still a lot of fun. If you've completed it before, it's one of those games where you can kind of remember how to do it, but sometimes you forget little bits. This isn't one that keeps drawing me back and back again. I played it again for this review, and I could just about remember how to complete the game. But it isn't really one of my go-to games on the Spectrum. If you've never played it before and you really love this kind of game, you might get some fun out of this. You might not though, some of the puzzles are obscure. The follow-up to this, Everyone's a Wally, I remember playing and figuring out a lot of the puzzles on my own. I did need to read the final solution from Crash, but I did manage to figure out quite a lot of the puzzles, and I think the same would be true of this. You could probably figure out a lot of the puzzles yourself, but then would need a bit of help on the final completion. There are some obscure ones. I quite often find that with things like point-and-click adventures. And in a way, this is quite similar to a point-and-click adventure in that you find the right object to do a task, and then you've got to work out the right place to use it to do that task. So that's my number 17 game, Pajama Armor. My number 16 game is Jetpack. Jetpack was released in 1983 by Ultimate Play the Game. Now what can I say about Jetpack that hasn't already been said? No. So that's my number 16 game, Jetpack. My number 15 game... Hold on. I don't think I can do that. Jetpack is so beloved of so many people, I can't just let it go without saying anything. In fact, in a lot of people's top lists of Spectrum games, I think this would be number 1. It was number 1 in Paul Jenkinson's top 10 Spectrum games that he did for the Spectrum show a few years back. Yes, Ultimate Play the Game games appear on my list again. This won't be the last one. And I don't think it's a surprise that I'm an unashamed Ultimate fan. Back in 1983, if you got a good Space Invaders clone with only a little bit of flicker, with character block movement and quite pretty sprites that played quite well, then you were lucky. Then Jetpack hit the scene and changed the Spectrum gaming world forever. This was Ultimate's first release and the best of their 16K games. You play Jetman and you have to assemble the bits of your rocket, shoot the aliens that are trying to stop you from doing that while you fill it up with fuel. There is a little bit of flicker on Jetman. I think I mentioned this before in this list. He does flicker a little bit. He's not perfectly animated. And it is a 16K game. There isn't a lot of variation in Jetpack. There's only a few different ways the baddies can move. So the first baddies move just vertically along the screen with some drifting down towards the bottom. Then the second set of baddies kind of bounce around the screen. Third, which are the bubbles kind of move like bubbles, almost slightly semi-randomly, and sometimes change direction like they've been caught in the wind, but are a bit slower and a bit more jittery. The fourth set of baddies are the aeroplanes. They're unique in that the aeroplanes only move in the way the aeroplanes do, and they kind of are homing missiles that fire from the left-hand side of the screen towards you. And of course, on that screen, there is the famous leeching point in Jetpack, where if you just leave Jetman on the middle platform and don't do anything, you don't even have to shoot, then the baddies will crash into that platform and your score will keep going up, and you can walk away and have a cup of tea and just ramp up a big score. I used this technique on Rare Replay for Jetpack to get 2 of the achievements, the number of baddies killed and the high score. And then finally, the 5th set of baddies home in on you. The 6th set, which are a kind of rounded cross, move in the same way that the bubbles do. The 7th set, which are kind of spaceships, they look a bit like Millennium Falcon, move in the same way that the first baddies do. And then finally, the last set of baddies, the kind of ones that look like frog faces, they home in on you the same as the flying saucers did. And that's it, the last set of baddies on the 2nd spaceship. And after that, when you get to the 3rd spaceship, you're back to the first set of baddies again. So there's very, very little variation in the way that the baddies move. The sprites change for them. But given this was just a 16k game, I think the memory went into the gameplay rather than making a lot of diverse baddies. And this is a terrific little shooter. I've said before in this list, I'm not a big fan of shoot-'em-ups. Really low down in the list there are a few shoot-'em-ups, but there haven't been any lately. And this is going to be the highest shoot-'em-up in my list. Well, kind of. Going back to what I said earlier about how this game really leapt ahead, how groundbreaking it was, and the Ultimate games had that polish, I think that's exactly what it did. It was an arcade type game on the Spectrum with polish. One thing that looks really good in this game is the laser effect. It's very reminiscent of the laser on Defender, the arcade game. Now I have done a walkthrough of this game where I loop it all the way back to the start. And in that I gave a shout out to ZX Frankie, who managed to get 1 million points on this game. And that was an amazing achievement. I've got to give him kudos again. I think he played the game for something like 7 hours without a break. He didn't even pause the game or use that leeching point that I mentioned to go to the loo or anything. He just played it solidly. I don't think I could have done that. Some of the longer games that I've had to do on this, I've actually paused the game or the emulator and gone for a drink or gone to the toilet while I've been doing it, and I haven't done any 7-hour stints. My 1 million points on Chucky Egg, which took me 2 hours, I did do straight through. I didn't have any breaks in that. But Frankie, once again, that was an amazing achievement. Well done. I did play Jetpack recently and thought, I wonder how long it would take me to get to 1 million points, and realised that it was going to be a very long time. I might not even reach it in 7 hours. I think he said he was wiped out for the next day as well. Going back to it now, it is still a great little shooter. This is a really, really good game and well worth picking up and having a go on if you've never played it before or if you have played it before. One thing I sometimes have seen new players struggle with is going down. If you press down on the joystick, you hover. Now that can be a little frustrating if you're trying to duck underneath an enemy, you press down and actually you stop moving downwards. One to watch out for any new players. But other than that, it's great. If you haven't played it, pick it up, give it a go. If you don't love it, what's wrong with you? So that really is my number 16 game, Jetpack. My number 15 game is Mushroom Man. Mushroom Man was released in 2009 by Hedgehog Spun Up Software, then re-released, I guess, in 2011 by Dr. Beep as Mushroom Man 2011. According to the World of Spectrum website, it's based on a Windows game called Mushroom Man as well. I've never played the Windows game, but I absolutely love this game, which I guess you guessed because it's so high in my top 100. This game should come with a health warning. It is incredibly addictive. It is the heroine of Spectrum games. I honestly don't think I've ever played a game that's been so much of a time sink. You just start playing this and you keep going and going and going. But don't let that put you off. This is a modern game, obviously. It was released in 2009. It's a freeware game. You can just download it straight from the World of Spectrum website and have a lot of fun playing it. As with many of the modern games in this list, I actually found this game courtesy of the Spectrum Bible Final Edition that does a lot of homebrew games. I'm kind of hoping they'll do another one of those now, it being I think 10 years since the last one. In the game you play Mushroom Man, and it's your job to find the exit on each level. The first few levels are kind of tutorial levels, so the first level's called Keys Open Locks. Then Cement Fills in Holes, Bribe the Guards with Money, and so on. And basically on each level you start with pretty much nothing, and you've got to use the things you find lying around to get past the various obstacles, holes, locks, guards, etc. There are also kind of teleports which are coloured, so green teleport puts you to the other green teleport, magenta to the other magenta teleport. If you get stuck on a level, you simply press R and start again. As I've said a few times in this list, some games seem to find a lot of depth and complexity out of simple ideas, and this is one of those. There are quite a lot of different objects that you can pick up or move, as well as the aforementioned ones. There's guns and bombs and beans that you can push. There's oxygen to get you through water. If you don't have oxygen and you go into water, you drown. Not a very nice experience, that. So there are quite a few different things that you can use. If I'm going to criticise this game, it's probably that the graphics are pretty simple. But then again, I'm someone who's still playing Spectrum games in 2016, so I can't really care that much about graphics. Thinking about it, you're someone who's listening to someone talk about Spectrum games in 2016, so surely you don't care that much about graphics either. As the game progresses, the levels slowly get harder and harder and harder until they get really, really difficult. There's one in particular called the Drowning Pool that I think is about level 78 that's particularly difficult. It took me a long time to work out how to get to the exit in the Drowning Pool. In the later levels, there are a few bugs in this game, and I've never actually managed to complete it and get through all the levels. I have done to about level 130 something. But that's still a load of gameplay. It's a bit disappointing when you start getting near the end and realise it's a bit buggy and you can't complete all the levels. For example, I think you eventually come to levels that end up having 3 of one particular colour's teleport on, and that doesn't work. If anyone does decide to play this game and get stuck, I have the first 120 levels solutions on my channel. There's no commentary, you'll just have to watch them, but they're all there. The reason I did that is actually when I was getting stuck on some of the later levels, I wanted to see if there was a video on YouTube of people completing the levels of this game. And there wasn't, so I decided, I'll make some. They've had a surprisingly large number of views. So there must be other people still playing this game right now. Maybe the Windows game, not the Spectrum version. Don't think there's much more to say about this game than that. It's really good fun, it's really addictive. If you like puzzle games, which I do, give it a go. So that's my number 15 game, Mushroom Man. My number 14 game is Krakatoa. Krakatoa was released in 1984 by Abex Electronics Limited. Now I think this game should have come about something like this. There were 3 guys in a room and 2 of them were arguing. One was saying that Defender was by far the best arcade game at that point in time. The other was saying, no, it's Scramble. Scramble's much better than Defender. Defender's too panicky. And the other guy was probably saying, well, that's what Eugene Jarvis was going for. He's been on record as saying he's trying to induce panic in the player when they were playing Defender. But the other guy said, yeah, but that went a bit too far. Scramble's just so much of a better game. It's accessible, you can do it, it's a challenge, it's got a great difficulty curve. Defender's just too hard from the outset. And they kept arguing, and the third guy just happened to be a really talented programmer, and he got sick of them arguing and he said, right, I'm going to develop a game that satisfies you both. And the result was Krakatoa, or Escape from Krakatoa as I've always known it. There was recently a write-up in Retro Gamer on Abex software, and I read that before recording this, hoping that they would give some background detail on Krakatoa. They don't give a lot, they just say that the developer who developed it, Paul Reynolds, also developed a number of other games for Abex. I actually don't think that Paul was in a room with two other guys arguing about whether Scramble or Defender was better before he developed this game. But I just like to think that. My memories of playing this game are really early in the Spectrum's life. This was one of the early games, so my cousin had it, and I think he gave me the tape of it actually. I may be making this up, but I have the feeling that I liked playing the game better than he did, and he said, oh yeah, there you go, you can have it. The first thing that strikes you about this game is my one criticism. The keys aren't on the cassette inlay, they're actually on a screen when you first load up the game, but they don't stay on that screen for very long. I'm pretty sure after a few goes I realised that what I needed to do was write the keys down on a bit of paper and put them in the cassette inlay. But that is the only criticism. Everything else about this game is absolutely brilliant. So you play a helicopter pilot, and you are defending a tanker that is under attack from submarines and V1 rockets. I have no idea why. It doesn't tell you on the cassette inlay. I think this backstory just starts with you almost in the middle of the battle, having been battling V1s and subs for days. The Krakatoa Volcano is of course part of the game and can erupt from time to time, which does give you a break from being attacked, but when the volcano erupts, there are people that come out of the houses nearby that you can rescue. You don't actually have to go and rescue them. What you can do is go back to base and get refueled, restocked with ammo, and have any minor damage to your helicopter repaired before heading back out to battle a relentless assault from the subs and V1s. Now, the rescuing people is obviously reminiscent of Defender. The other thing that's reminiscent of Defender is you can reverse. You can kind of thrust and reverse controls the same way as you did in Defender. Then you can shoot, well, it's probably a machine gun. You kind of shoot bullets out of the front of your helicopter and drop bombs from the bottom of your helicopter. Bullets being useful for dispatching the V1 rockets and bombs being useful for dispatching the subs. And with the rockets and scrolling landscape, I think that's what makes me think this is reminiscent of Scramble. And the fact that you have a gun and a bomb as well. You can also drop or retract a rope from the bottom of your helicopter, which is what you do to rescue people. If the tanker is hit, people will jump off it and you can rescue them out of the sea as well. There's also at the start of the game a little dinghy that will rescue the people. However, that quickly gets destroyed, either accidentally by you or by a sub. And occasionally the dinghy driver will just ram the dinghy into your helicopter and destroy that outright. You only have one life in this game, although as I said, you can get your helicopter repaired if it is damaged. At the end of a certain period of time, you're told that an attack wave is over, and attack waves get steadily more difficult with more subs and more missiles coming. And at the end of those attack waves, you will get a bonus based on the level and how functional the tanker is. For the time, the graphics in this game are actually pretty good. They're pretty basic, but not bad. They're about as good as you would get at the time. This was way back in 1984, and I think it must have been early in 1984 that this game came out. It was certainly out before Christmas of 1984. Even now, it is a great game to go back to. Don't let the keys put you off. First off, just finding where the keys are is difficult enough because they're not on the screen very long, as I said. And secondly, they are slightly awkward at first, but you soon get the hang of them, and actually they're quite intelligently placed for those Defender-style thrust and reverse keys. This is a game without an end. It's a shoot 'em up where you just keep shooting them up and shooting them up. It gets harder and harder and harder. Sometimes I do think, well, why would you bother? The tanker's always going to be destroyed because you're always going to be destroyed. Why are you doing this? I guess that just makes it a high-score attack game. Going back to it now, I still find it addictive. I still enjoy playing it. I do play from time to time. It isn't my go-to game on the Spectrum, but it is one that I really enjoy. One thing I really like is when you get the highest score, a little tune plays, and I really like that tune. It was a really good tune for a Spectrum. So that's my number 14 game, Krakatoa. My number 13 game is Nightlaw. Nightlaw was released in 1984 by Ultimate Play the Game. These days, I think it's easy to underestimate the impact that Nightlaw had when it first came out. The only thing up to that point that had looked remotely like this on any home computer was Ant Attack. And even then, Ant Attack didn't have that kind of big, bold look that Nightlaw has. I'm sure it's up there with games like Doom or GoldenEye, first-person shooters that really defined the genre. And in the same way that those games cloned a load of copycats, so did Nightlaw, including Ultimate's own copycat, Alien 8. And as those who have listened to my top 10 will know, I do consider Alien 8 a better game, but don't let that make you think I'm not a big fan of Nightlaw. Nightlaw was amazing when it came out, and still amazing now. I really enjoy playing Nightlaw even to this day. This was the third Saberman game after Saberwolf and Underworld. The story being that after being bitten by Saberwolf, Saberman has become a werewolf. And he's travelled to the castle of Nightlaw to seek the help of the wizard Melchior in reversing the spell. To do this, Saberman has to collect a number of charms, 14 in total, and deposit them in Melchior's Cauldron. The game plays out through 40 days and nights, which are indicated by either a sun or a moon in a little animation on the bottom right hand side of the screen. And when the sun's showing, Saberman is Saberman, and when the moon's showing, he's the werewolf. I do remember reading once that there is a difference between them. Someone once said that you can jump further when you're the wolf, but I'm not sure that's true. I played this game a lot, and I don't think there's really any difference between the way they play. There is a difference in the way that certain things will react to you in the game. So there are baddies that will come after you when you're the wolf, and either leave you alone or move away from you when you're Saberman. And there's one room in particular that if you walk into as the wolf, it is basically game over. Portcullises drop over either door, and a kind of bouncy ball thing will just come after you and kill you if you go into that room as the wolf. Not good. Also, if you go into Melchior's room as the wolf, a spell will come out of his cauldron and chase after you, and that will kill you too. Not good. However, I think those two are the only two not good things about this game. The often quoted rumour about this game is it was finished even before Saberwolf, or about the same time as Saberwolf, but the Stamper brothers didn't want to release it because they thought it would compete with Saberwolf. I think they said something like the Spectrum market wasn't ready for it at the time, and it wasn't. As I hinted at earlier, when it did hit, it spawned a load of copycats. There were hundreds and hundreds of them. There were some good ones, the John Rittman and Bernie Drummond games being Batman and Head Over Heels. I'd probably include Monster Max for the Game Boy as well in that list, because that's one of my favourite games. I always thought those games were slightly different though. I've said this before, they were more puzzle games than 3D platform games. But maybe I'm splitting hairs when I'm making that distinction. There were some other good ones. I think Sweevo's World and Hydrofool always had a good reputation as well, although I've never played those. And I think there were loads that just thought if they were a 3D isometric game, they'd sell a load, so the gameplay wasn't as good on some of the copycats. A few years ago at Play Expo, there was a debate about which was better for games, the Commodore or the Spectrum. I think the conclusion was they were both about the same. They weren't going to upset any apple carts in that. During that debate, Jeff Minter said, "Thank God the Commodore 64 couldn't do 3D isometric games, because if it had, it would have been overrun with copycat clones just like the Spectrum was." At the time, I thought that was a little unfair, because I don't think the Spectrum was overrun with copycat clones. There weren't only 3D isometric games that came out from 1984 till the end of the Spectrum's life, sometime in the very early 90s. However, he was right, there were a lot of them. The 14 charms that you have to collect take various forms. And I think this was the first game that started to bring that British humour into Ultimate and then Rare games. So the charms you get are kind of, or some of them are kind of reminiscent of cartoons. An old boot's one of them. And a bottle of poison. And a bottle, and a chalice, and a cup. There's a ruby. Well, I think it's a ruby, because when you collect it, it's always red. I always thought it was a diamond at first, but then you collect it and the graphic on the bottom left-hand side, which shows you your inventory, is always red. And as I said before, this is kind of a platformer. To collect these charms, you've normally got to jump over some series of obstacles in one way or another. Ultimate called the engine that this was written on Filmation, And the idea being that it was like a film. You could use the set or props in the game to influence what you did in the game. For example, there's one room where there are a load of spiked balls on top of some tables, and you kind of have to push the tables in a particular way to be able to get through them without the spiked balls dropping on your head. Some rooms contain traps. So there was one I mentioned earlier where if you go in as a wolf, basically you're dead and it's game over. There are others where when you pick up an object, those spiked balls I mentioned earlier start to drop from the ceiling. There are others where blocks will disappear or slowly descend when you touch them or when you stand on them. And all of this makes for a really, really good game. I have done a walkthrough for this game, but I haven't done one with commentary. Someone actually asked on that walkthrough if I could do one with commentary. I will do one with commentary. The map to this game is absolutely huge. I think there's about 140 rooms in total. But to complete the game, you don't need to visit every single room in the castle. Now, I've never been sure whether that's a flaw in the game or not. I quite like that you don't have to. It means you can pick and choose which puzzles you want to tackle. There's an area to the north of the castle that has a really tricky room to get back through to get back to the Cauldron. And I always avoid that if I possibly can. In fact, it took me ages and ages to work out how to complete that room. When I was doing the playing tips for the Spectrum show, I did actually do a playing tip on how to get back through it. As I said, going back to it now, it's still a really, really good game. I still enjoy playing it. I'll play it every now and then just to keep my hand in so I can keep completing it. And it does provide a good challenge when you do that. Even now, it's a bit of a challenge. It's not something you can just walk through really easily. When you first play it, the 40 days and 40 nights time limit can be a bit tricky, but once you get proficient, that doesn't make much of a difference either. If you want to play it now, it's distribution denied, but you can get it on Rare Replay. And as I've said before in this top 100, Rare Replay is well worth buying anyway. So that's my number 13 game, Nightlaw. My number 12 game is Manic Miner. Manic Miner was released in 1983 by Bug-Byte Software. It was written by Matthew Smith, and when Matthew later defected to Software Project from Bug-Byte, it was also released by Software Project. I don't think enough is said about how much of a genius Matthew Smith was. This was an amazing game when it hit the Spectrum, absolutely wonderful. For me, it is still the game that defined the platforming genre. And when I look at platforming games of these days, things like Mario that's still going very, very strong, the one thing that gets me is you have momentum. Now, I don't know about you, but when I'm walking along, it's very, very rare that I kind of slow down and skid the way Mario does. I normally come to a pretty abrupt halt, which is exactly what Miner Willy does. So for me, Miner Willy's right, Mario's wrong. Although don't get me wrong, I do actually really like Mario games as well. The backstory to this game is you are Miner Willy and you've been trapped in some caves below Surbiton. And this mine is really ancient and was built by a civilization superior to our own, and it used robots to do the mining. These robots have continued to mine and accumulate really, really precious things in the mine, which quite often seem to take the form of keys. You then have to go through the mine and collect the keys and then make it to the exit. Each room in the mine only has a small amount of air, and if you use up all the air, you're dead. If you collide with any of the robots that are still active in the mine, you're dead. There are also static things in the mine which will also kill you. I don't know why bushes kill you. I never really got that when I first played it. The bushes look kind of mean, but there's green bushes on the first screen, and if you collide with them, you're dead. You have 3 lives in the game, but you get an extra life every 10,000 points, and you need those extra lives if you're going to complete the game. Although, I think if you go all the way to the end, you probably only get 2 or maybe 3 additional lives. I know I normally get my first additional life in the vat. Years ago, online somewhere, I actually think it was the comp.sys.sinclair news group, there was a debate went on which was the earliest room you could get your first extra life in. I actually think it was quite a lot earlier than that. I don't know how people did that. I guess strategically dying after collecting the items in a particular room where there were lots and lots of items. Can't think of which one that would have been though. If anyone listening to this knows or remembers that, can you let me know how you would do it, please? I read an interview with Matthew Smith once where he said he thinks that his real skill was being able to create really, really good sprites. And I think this is the game where he started to do this. His previous game for the Spectrum is one called Sticks, which I do like. But this was so much better and such a big leap up from Sticks. Another thing about this game that I remember Matthew Smith saying was the central cavern, the first screen you come into, is quite tricky. It's not as tricky as some of the later screens, but it is quite tricky. And that was because that was the experimentation one. Once he'd done that, the other screens he made the first few pretty easy, and then they get gradually harder. For me, the easiest screen in the entire game has to be the abandoned uranium workings. There are two baddies in that are seals balancing bowls on their noses. Why this ancient civilization needed machines that looked like that, I do not know, but they did. And I've never ever been killed by them. In fact, I'm not sure how you could get into the position where you would be killed by them. You'd have to make a serious mistake to get trapped by one of those seals. As the game goes on, the screens do get really, really difficult. I always have a kind of blind spot, a bit of a psychological barrier when I come to the Skylab landing bay. I don't know why that screen always gets me. I nearly always die in that screen, and once I do, I just think I keep dying and will quite often end the game at that screen. If I do get past that, the last four screens, or the last three screens anyway, the warehouse, the Amoebatron's Revenge and the solar power generator are really difficult. The final barrier is a bit easier, but still is pretty tricky. It's about as tricky as the central cavern, I'd say. Not easy, you have to do some standing jumps to complete it. The follow-up to this game was, of course, Jet Set Willy, and again, as people who will have listened to my top 10, you'll know that I do hold Jet Set Willy in higher regard than Manic Miner. That's quite a recent occurrence though. That only happened when I practiced Jet Set Willy enough to be able to complete it, and I really came to appreciate what a good game Jet Set Willy was. And that's not to take anything away from Manic Miner. Manic Miner is an absolutely terrific game. At the end of the game, when Willy dies, a huge big boot comes down and squashes him, and it was often said that that was inspired by Monty Python. Matthew Smith has gone on record as saying that was wrong though. He just wanted a big boot to squash Willy. There was an issue of Retro Gamer where they interviewed Matthew Smith. In fact, this issue of Retro Gamer is really, really good. It is just all about Manic Miner. And there was an interview with Matthew Smith where he went through every single one of the rooms and talked about them. In the walkthrough I've done for this game, I do give a few little snippets of what he said about each of the rooms in that. Even if you watch that, it is well worth seeking out that edition of Retro Gamer. Because that interview is absolutely fantastic. It's brilliant. Just find the issue. I think you can download them as PDFs these days, so just get the PDF. I don't know how much it would cost, but it is worth the price. As with the previous game in this top 10, it is actually easy to underestimate how much of an impact this game had. And if you haven't worked it out already, I am a huge big fan of Matthew Smith. I'm a huge big fan of his games and this game. I can't go on and on about how much of a genius the guy is. Maybe I should stop there before I get too gushy. So that's my number 12 game, Manic Miner. My number 11 game is Bard's Tale. Bard's Tale was released in 1988 by Electronic Arts. Or is it the Bard's Tale? I actually think the full title is The Bard's Tale: Tales of the Unknown. It is one of the earliest examples of the kind of RPG games where you have a 3D perspective where you move in blocks. And despite it being an early example, it is an absolutely terrific game. It is a wonderful game. It's also quite an early example of a game that used multi-load on the Spectrum. I was never a fan of multi-load games. I'd rather have just had the whole game. I'd prefer a slightly cut down game, so one that used multi-load, but this one was so good that I didn't even mind. I recently found my copy of Bard's Tale from way, way back in the day. And by the time Bard's Tale came out, I don't think I was playing many Spectrum games, but this really got me back into the Spectrum. And there was the cassette and the inlay and a load of pieces of paper where I'd drawn maps of the various dungeons in the game. In the game, you play a party of adventurers, and you can either use the predefined party or create your own party. And I would use a kind of mix of the two. I'd keep people like Brian the Fist and El Cid from the predefined party, but also create some of my own characters. In particular, I was always into the Dragonlance Dungeons and Dragons game books, so I'd always create myself an extra wizard called Rastlin, who is one of the characters from those books. And I think if I remember rightly, I delete the thief. There was a thief in the original party, and I never saw why you had a thief. There was a really low level spell called Trap Zap that you could use to disarm traps, and that seemed to be the only use for your thief. So having a wizard that could do that was better than a thief anyway, because the wizards could do lots of other things. So your party has to wander around the village of Skara Brae, which has been locked in perpetual winter, and what you're trying to do is defeat the evil wizard Mangar. But before you can do this, you need to develop your party up to be hard enough to be able to take him on. In a recent edition of Retro Gaming Roundup, they did their top 10 gaming manuals. And for a few of them, Bard's Tale 2 and Eye of the Beholder, they were saying how much like a Dungeons and Dragons manual some of those manuals were. Now, the Bard's Tale booklet is only actually quite a small booklet, but it is really, really filled with detail. There's backstory and details on all the different character classes and the different races you can have. And there's also the huge list of spells. One of the things that I really liked about this game and really made it stand out was the massive list of spells you could have. There are 4 different classes of wizard, and any particular magic user you have can move between the different classes. Each of those classes has 7 levels, and there are a certain number of spells for each of those levels. The Conjurer, the Magician and the Sorcerer each have a total of 22 spells, and the Wizard has a total of 13 spells, making a total of 79 spells in the entire game. That's quite a lot of spells. Each spell has a 4-letter code that you use to cast it. And in a way, I guess that was a type of copy protection, because unless you knew what all those spells were, you wouldn't be able to cast them. The spells are the usual mix. There's some that are offensive, some that are defensive, some that have other effects like the Trap Zap spell I mentioned earlier. And as your wizard increases in skills and levels, and as he gains more levels, the spells get more and more powerful. I seem to remember when you get to a really high level wizard, there's one called Mangar's Mind Blade that is absolutely fantastic. One of the other things that the spells can do is summon additional people to your party. So you can get additional characters that come and will help you fight. And getting a greater demon is probably the best of these. Although dragons tend to be quite good as well when they join your party. When you first start out in this game, it can be pretty difficult to survive. I remember one of the hardest things being just getting your characters over the first few levels so they could be tough enough to survive a bit longer than a few excursions into Skara Brae. However, once you get over that initial difficulty hump and start to find some of the dungeons, the first one being the cellars and then the sewers below the Scarlet Bard, right deep down there, you will find the name of the Mad God, which gives you access to the Mad God's catacombs. You then should be good enough to go into the castle. Then I think there's Corellian's Tower. Corellian, I think, is the good wizard in the game, although I may have got his name wrong. And eventually, you'll be ready for the final assault on Mangar's castle, or Mangar's Tower. Yeah, I've never got that far in the game, by the way. I've got pretty far into it, but I've never actually completed this game. It is a very good game, though. I think originally it was a PC game and it was ported to a number of computers, which is probably the reason that it needs multi-load. I do remember my friend Lee Fryer discovering that if you loaded the header for one dungeon, you could then forward the tape to find the main body of another dungeon. So you could go to, say, the Scarlet Board and load the header for that, and then load in the castle or one of the towers or something else. That was a useful little hack that would mean that you could, say, for example, get in the Mad God's catacombs without actually finding out his name. Now, there have been a lot of really, really good games in this list. And I think my justification for putting this so high is that it is just so addictive. I spent hours and hours and hours playing this game. And then when I went back to play it again for some gameplay, I played it for probably 2 solid weeks. I worked my party up, I started to get better and better spells and better equipment, and I just kept playing and playing and playing it until actually I had quite a good party. I do remember back in the day there were some unintentionally funny things in this game. It does have a bit of a tongue-in-cheek humour anyway, but there were some things that were kind of unintentionally funny. Like the descriptions of some of the spells could be completely out of canter with the damage that they did. There's one spell that says something like, you completely destroy your enemy's entire physical form for 3 points of damage. It might not have been that extreme, but we used to have a bit of a good laugh about it back in the day. I was slightly surprised to find this wasn't distribution denied on the World of Spectrum website. If you want to play it, you can just go and download it and play it, which is rather good. If you're a fan of this type of game, then I'd recommend that you download it. It is a really, really good game. The graphics are pretty basic, and you've got to remember it is an early example of this kind of genre. But it's well worth going and downloading. It doesn't do things like auto map for you or anything like that. You have to draw your own maps, so download them from online. I'm sure you can get them from somewhere. One nice touch is that all the maps for all the different versions of the game, I think, are pretty much exactly the same, so you don't have to seek out the Spectrum-specific versions of the maps to be able to play it. Later on, it does get a bit tricky, and there are some really, really nasty traps. It just gets very, very hard to make any progress in the game, which is why I stopped. I think my friend Lee did actually persevere and complete it. If you want something similar for a more modern system, there were a series of games called Etrian Odyssey on the Nintendo DS, which are very, very similar and worth seeking out. I have all of those, although I've only played the first 2. I never ended up playing the third one. I think I had to buy them on import as well, but luckily the DS is region free. There were sequels to this game. There was a Bard's Tale 3 and 2, but they never made it to the Spectrum. On the Spectrum, there was only the original Bard's Tale, but very good it was too. So that's my number 11 game, Bard's Tale, The Tales of the Unknown. So that's my top 100 games, numbers 20 to 11. At 20, we had Trashman. At 19, Saberwolf. At 18, The Wild Bunch. 17, Pajama Armor. 16, Jetpack. 15, Mushroom Man. 14, Krakatoa. 13, Night Law, 12, Manic Miner, and at number 11 was Bard's Tale. Hope you enjoyed that. Until next time, happy gaming!